There is a specific kind of silence that has nothing to do with quiet. It is not the silence of an empty room or a peaceful morning or a conversation that has simply run its course. It is the silence that falls when something has just been said in front of witnesses that cannot be unsaid, something that has crossed a line so fundamental that the air itself seems to need a moment to process what just happened. That is the silence that filled Judge Judy's courtroom on the afternoon that will be remembered as the single most expensive miscalculation in the show's 25-year history. Every person in that room, the audience members, the production staff, the court officers, the attorneys, had stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. And at the center of all of it, behind the bench, Judge Judy Sheindlin sat with her hands folded on the desk in front of her and said absolutely nothing. She was not angry. Anyone who has watched Judge Judy for any length of time knows what her anger looks like. It is loud and precise and surgical. What was sitting behind that bench in that moment was something entirely different. It was the specific, glacial calm of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since before the cameras turned on, a woman who had known exactly how this day was going to end before the person sitting across from her had walked through the door. And the woman sitting across from her had absolutely no idea. What you are about to witness is not a courtroom case about an HOA violation. It is not a dispute about a garden or a bylaw or a fine. It is the story of the single most expensive miscalculation a wealthy, powerful woman has ever made on live American television. It is the story of someone who had spent 11 consecutive years buying her way out of every consequence that a normal person would have faced, someone who had perfected the art of making problems disappear with a check or a legal threat or a well-timed phone call to the right person. She had bribed city officials. She had hired and deployed armies of attorneys whose sole purpose was to make lawsuits so financially painful that the people filing them had no choice but to walk away. She had settled disputes privately before they could become public record, ensuring that her name remained clean and her reputation remained intact and her position of power remained unquestioned. In 11 years of doing exactly this, she had never once faced a room she couldn't buy, a person she couldn't pressure, or a situation she couldn't control with money. And then she walked into Judge Judy's courtroom carrying a leather briefcase and $50,000 worth of confidence, and she tried to do it one more time. Directly. In writing. On her personal letterhead. In front of 14 million viewers who were about to watch the whole thing detonate in real time. Her name is Diana Caldwell, and she is 58 years old, and until the day she walked into that courtroom, she had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a masterpiece of authority and control. She is the HOA president of Silverbrook Heights, a gated residential community in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the average home sells for $1.2 million and the monthly HOA fees run $800 per household. The community has 1,400 homes, manicured common areas that are photographed for real estate listings across the state, and a reputation for the kind of pristine, orderly appearance that certain buyers pay a significant premium to be surrounded by. Diana Caldwell has held the HOA presidency for 11 consecutive years, winning each annual election through a combination of financial intimidation directed at anyone who considered running against her and social manipulation so carefully executed that most of her neighbors genuinely believed they were choosing her freely. She drives a white Range Rover through the streets of Silverbrook Heights with a custom vanity license plate that reads Rule Set, which her neighbors have noted over the years is less of a clever pun and more of an accurate description of how she views her relationship with the community she governs. She employs a dedicated HOA enforcement assistant, an actual salaried position paid from HOA community funds, whose entire professional existence consists of driving through the neighborhood with a camera, photographing potential violations, and drafting the legal notices that Diana reviews and signs each morning before 9 o'clock. In 11 years, Diana Caldwell has initiated formal legal action against 23 homeowners. She has forced 14 families to sell their homes and leave the community. She has never once lost a legal dispute. Not because she has always been right, but because she has never once faced a judge she couldn't influence, an opponent she couldn't outlast with legal fees, or a situation she couldn't resolve by making it more financially painful to fight than to surrender. Rosa Mendez is 64 years old, and she taught third grade for 34 years at Jefferson Elementary School in Phoenix, Arizona, and she is the reason any of this matters. Rosa bought her home in Silverbrook Heights 7 years ago using every dollar of her retirement savings and a small life insurance payout from her husband Eduardo, who had died of a heart attack 2 years earlier at the age of 67, 2 months before his own retirement was scheduled to begin. Eduardo had worked as a civil engineer for 31 years. He had talked, in the last years of his life, about the garden he was going to plant when he finally had time. Tomatoes, he had told Rosa. 6 varieties of tomatoes, and peppers, and cilantro, and squash, and 3 kinds of herbs he had been reading about. He had drawn a rough sketch of it on the back of a grocery receipt one evening at the kitchen table, labeling each section in his careful, deliberate handwriting, and Rosa had kept that receipt in her wallet through his illness and his death and the long quiet aftermath of both. When she moved into Silverbrook Heights, she planted the garden in her backyard because Eduardo had wanted one and she had never had time while she was teaching, and she finally had time now. The garden was not visible from the street. It sat entirely within the enclosed rear yard of her property. It violated no aesthetic standard that any reasonable person would recognize as such. It harmed no neighbor, depressed no property value, disturbed no view. But it violated Section 14, Paragraph C of the Silverbrook Heights HOA governing documents, which stated that vegetable gardens in rear yards required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, a committee whose membership consisted entirely of people appointed by Diana Caldwell and chaired by Diana Caldwell herself. Rosa had not known about Section 14, Paragraph C when she planted Eduardo's garden. And by the time she found out, she had already received the first of 11 violation notices, and the fines had already begun to accumulate toward the $22,000 that now sat as a lien against the home that Eduardo had helped her afford, threatening to take from her the last physical piece of the life they had built together. What Diana Caldwell did not know when she agreed to appear on Judge Judy was that the producers of the show had not simply accepted Rosa's complaint and scheduled a hearing. They had spent 6 weeks doing something that no one in Silverbrook Heights had ever done before. They had actually looked. They had contacted 31 former residents of the community, people who had sold and moved away during Diana's 11-year presidency, and they had listened to what those people had to say. They had submitted public records requests for the HOA's financial documents under Arizona's disclosure laws. They had obtained comparative data on violation notices issued across the community. They had found a former board member who had resigned 4 years earlier and had been waiting, with considerable patience, for someone to ask him the right questions. Everything they found had been organized, verified, and placed inside a manila envelope that was sitting in the center of Judge Judy's desk when Diana Caldwell walked through the courtroom doors carrying her leather briefcase and her expression of absolute, unshakable certainty that this was going to go exactly the way everything always went for her. But here is what sealed it. Before the cameras rolled, during the routine pre-show producer meeting that every litigant attends before filming begins, Diana Caldwell did something that no one in the 25-year history of Judge Judy had ever done. She approached the senior producer on the case and handed him a letter. It was printed on her personal letterhead, cream-colored, heavy stock, her name embossed at the top in a font that was chosen to project exactly the right amount of authority. In it, she offered a $50,000 consulting contribution to the show's production company in exchange for what she described as reasonable editorial framing of the case, citing the sensitive nature of certain financial matters that might arise during proceedings and expressing her belief that a mutually beneficial arrangement would serve all parties involved. The producer read the letter once. He walked directly to Judge Judy's chambers. Judge Judy read it once, folded it along its original crease, and placed it carefully inside the manila envelope that was already sitting on her desk. Then she said 4 words to the producer before she stood up to walk to the bench. 4 words that, in hindsight, should have been a warning to every person in that building about exactly what was coming. She said, "This is going to be something." Before we go any further, if you have ever lived next to someone like Diana Caldwell, someone who thought their money made them untouchable, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from, because this story is about to get so much worse before it gets so much better. Diana Caldwell entered the courtroom first, and everything about the way she moved communicated a single message to everyone watching. She walked the way people walk when they have never genuinely feared a room in their adult life. Her cream-colored Armani blazer was pressed without a single crease. Her hair had been professionally styled that morning, not to look glamorous but to look authoritative, the kind of controlled, expensive appearance that says I am someone whose time matters more than yours before a single word has been spoken. She had hired a media consultant 3 weeks before the filming date, a former television producer who had spent 2 sessions coaching her on courtroom body language, eye contact calibration, and how to project sympathetic competence rather than the cold institutional authority that her neighbors in Silverbrook Heights would have recognized immediately. Her attorney, a real estate specialist from Phoenix who billed $600 an hour, walked precisely 2 steps behind her carrying a leather satchel that contained 4 color-coded binders of documentation, each one tabbed with adhesive flags in 3 different colors representing different categories of legal argument. Diana placed her briefcase on the defendant's table with the deliberate care of someone arranging furniture in a room they already own, pulled out her chair, sat down, and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of a person who has never once sat in a chair that didn't belong to her. Rosa Mendez entered from the opposite door 40 seconds later, and the contrast was so complete that several audience members would later describe it as the moment they understood exactly what kind of case this actually was. Rosa was wearing a blue dress she had purchased 8 years ago for Eduardo's retirement party, the party that happened 2 months before he died without ever getting to retire. She was carrying a single manila folder containing photographs of her garden, her violation notices arranged in chronological order, and Eduardo's hand-drawn garden sketch on the back of a grocery receipt, which her granddaughter had helped her place inside a clear protective sleeve so it wouldn't get damaged. Rosa sat down, placed the folder on the table in front of her, folded her hands on top of it, and looked straight ahead with the particular quiet dignity of someone who has run completely out of things to lose and has therefore also run completely out of fear. The studio audience made its assessment of both women within the first 30 seconds, the way audiences always do, through the small involuntary signals that humans broadcast without knowing it. An elderly woman in the second row moved her purse to the far side of her body when Diana passed, an instinctive protective gesture that she almost certainly did not notice herself making. A man in the 4th row leaned toward his wife and said something quietly. She nodded without taking her eyes off Diana. The court officer, a 20-year veteran of the show who had stood in that room through thousands of cases and thousands of litigants, later told producers that he had known within 10 seconds of Diana's entrance that this case was different. He had seen the look on Judge Judy's face when Diana sat down. It was not the look Judge Judy wore when she was preparing to hear a case. It was the look she wore when she had already heard enough and was simply waiting for the right moment to say so. Judge Judy opened the proceedings, looked at both women with equal measure, and said 7 words that the audience would not fully understand until much later. She said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, "Let's find out who you really are." Judge Judy began the way she always begins, with questions that sound routine until you realize, usually too late, that they are not routine at all. She asked Diana Caldwell how long the vegetable garden had existed on Rosa Mendez's property. Diana answered smoothly, with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed this exact exchange with her media consultant. "Approximately 14 months, Your Honor," she said, which was long enough to establish a pattern of deliberate non-compliance. Judge Judy wrote something on her notepad and said nothing. She asked whether Rosa had been given written notification of Section 14, Paragraph C specifically before the first violation notice was issued. Diana said that all residents received the full governing documents at closing and were therefore responsible for understanding their obligations. Judge Judy wrote something else on her notepad and said nothing. She asked whether Rosa had been offered the opportunity to apply for architectural committee approval before the fines began accumulating, or whether the violation notices had proceeded directly to financial penalty without any corrective grace period. Diana's answer took 4 sentences longer than it needed to because the truthful version was only 2 words long, and those 2 words were not available to her. Judge Judy watched her use all 4 sentences and then wrote something on her notepad, and the audience was beginning to understand that whatever was being written on that notepad was not working in Diana Caldwell's favor. Diana had answered every question with the fluid, unhesitating confidence of someone who had been the most authoritative person in every room she had entered for 11 consecutive years. What she had not accounted for, because she had never needed to account for it before, was the specific experience of being questioned by someone who already knew the answers. Judge Judy had read the financial records. She had read the affidavits. She had read the comparative enforcement data. And she had read the $50,000 letter on cream-colored letterhead that was sitting folded inside the manila envelope on her desk. Every question she had asked Diana in the opening examination was not a question at all. It was a measurement. She was measuring the precise distance between what Diana Caldwell was willing to say on camera and what the documents in that envelope already proved was true. That distance, it was becoming clear, was considerable. Judge Judy set down her pen, reached for the manila envelope, and removed the first document with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. She held it up briefly so that the cameras could register its existence, then looked down at it and began to speak. The document was a financial audit of the Silverbrook Heights HOA fund, obtained through Arizona's public records disclosure laws, covering the full 11 years of Diana Caldwell's presidency. Judge Judy read from it without editorial comment, allowing the numbers to carry their own weight, which they did with remarkable efficiency. In 11 years, the HOA had collected $4.7 million in violation fines from Silverbrook Heights residents. Of that $4.7 million, $890,000 could not be accounted for in the official HOA financial statements. It did not appear in maintenance expenditure records. It did not appear in legal fee documentation. It did not appear in any capital improvement fund or reserve account. It simply was not there. Additionally, Diana Caldwell's annual salary as HOA president, a position that is by its nature a volunteer role and is unpaid in virtually every residential community in the United States, had been set at $95,000 per year. This salary had been approved by the HOA Board of Directors. The board of directors consisted of Diana Caldwell, her sister, and her sister's husband, both of whom owned investment properties within the community and both of whom had been appointed to the board by Diana without a community vote. Diana's composure did something in that moment that her media consultant had specifically told her not to let happen on camera. It fractured. Not dramatically, not in any way that looked like guilt to the untrained eye, but in the specific, technical way that composure fractures when a person is suddenly doing the mental arithmetic of exposure and finding that the numbers do not work out in their favor. She opened her mouth and began a sentence about accounting procedures and fiscal year timing differences and the complexity of community fund management, and she was perhaps 12 words into that sentence when Judge Judy raised one finger. Diana stopped talking. The finger stayed raised for 2 full seconds. Then Judge Judy said 3 words that landed in the courtroom like 3 separate stones dropped into still water. She said, "I am not finished." She reached into the envelope again and removed the second document. This one was a comparative analysis of HOA violation notices issued across Silverbrook Heights during Diana's presidency, cross-referenced against the demographic profiles of the homeowners who received them. Judge Judy did not editorialize. She did not need to. The data spoke in a language that required no translation. Homeowners with Spanish, Vietnamese, and Haitian surnames had received violation notices at a rate 340% higher than homeowners with Anglo-European surnames for identical bylaw infractions. 3 specific properties, all owned by individuals who had made documented financial contributions to Diana's HOA re-election campaigns, had active and visible bylaw violations that had never generated a single notice despite being observable from the public street for periods ranging from 8 months to 3 years. Rosa Mendez's vegetable garden, located entirely within her enclosed rear yard and invisible from any public or shared space in the community, had generated 11 violation notices and $22,000 in accumulated fines over 14 months. The audience did not gasp this time. They went very still, which was worse, because stillness in a room full of people means that something has just confirmed what everyone already suspected, and the confirmation is somehow more terrible than the suspicion was. Diana's attorney leaned over and placed his mouth close to her ear. Whatever he said took approximately 4 seconds. Diana straightened in her chair afterward and addressed Judge Judy in a voice she was working very hard to keep level. "Your Honor," she said, "correlation is not causation. The selective enforcement allegations being implied by those figures represent a politically motivated interpretation of routine administrative decisions. Each violation notice was issued on the basis of the governing documents alone, without reference to the identity of the homeowner involved." Judge Judy looked at her for a long moment, the kind of long moment that has a specific weight to it, the weight of a person deciding how much of what they know to reveal and in what order. Then she said, quietly and without any visible emotion, "No. But intent is intent." She reached into the envelope one final time and removed the third document. It was a sworn and notarized affidavit from Gerald Okafor, a former member of the Silverbrook Heights HOA board who had resigned his position 4 years earlier and subsequently sold his home and relocated his family to another community. In the affidavit, Gerald described attending a closed board meeting during his tenure in which Diana Caldwell had explicitly directed her enforcement assistant to prioritize violation inspections in the south section of Silverbrook Heights. When a board member had asked why the south section specifically, Diana had provided an answer that Gerald Okafor had written down verbatim in a personal journal that same evening and from which he quoted directly in his affidavit. She had said that residents in the south section were least likely to have the resources to fight back and therefore represented the most efficient use of enforcement hours. The courtroom did not gasp and did not go still. It did something in between, a collective, involuntary intake of breath that was not quite a gasp but was too sharp to be silence. The sound a room makes when something ugly that everyone suspected has just been confirmed in writing under oath by someone with direct personal knowledge. Rosa Mendez put her hand over her mouth. Diana Caldwell fixed her gaze on a point on the wall directly in front of her and held it there with an expression of perfect blankness that was, in its own way, the most damning thing anyone in that courtroom had seen all day. The courtroom after the Okafor affidavit was a different place than it had been before it. Something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the room, the way the air shifts before a storm when the pressure drops and everything goes quiet and still and expectant. Diana's attorney had capped his pen. His legal pad was closed and pushed to the side of the table, which told everyone who understood what that meant that a $600 an hour attorney had made the professional calculation that there was nothing left in this case worth writing down. Diana herself had not moved or spoken since Judge Judy had finished reading the affidavit aloud. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and her eyes fixed on that same point on the wall, and she had the appearance of someone who was holding themselves together through sheer muscular effort, as though the moment she moved or spoke or allowed her expression to change, everything she was holding would simply come apart at once. She made one final attempt. She straightened in her chair, smoothed the front of her blazer with both hands, and addressed Judge Judy in the measured, authoritative tone that had ended 100 difficult conversations in her favor over 11 years. "Your Honor," she said, "I have dedicated 11 years of my life to building and maintaining a community that homeowners are proud to live in. Every decision I have made has been in service of the residents of Silverbrook Heights. The allegations contained in that affidavit are the grievances of a disgruntled former board member who left under difficult circumstances and has carried a personal vendetta ever since. The financial discrepancies Your Honor referenced are accounting timing differences that our certified public accountant can clarify completely, and I would welcome the opportunity to provide that documentation at any." Judge Judy raised one finger. Diana stopped. The finger did not come down for 3 full seconds. Then Judge Judy reached into the manila envelope and removed the final document. She held it at a slight distance from her body, the way people hold something they find genuinely distasteful, and she began to read Diana Caldwell's $50,000 bribe letter aloud, word for word, in its entirety, including the sentence about the sensitive nature of certain financial matters and the mutually beneficial arrangement, while 14 million people watched Diana Caldwell's face lose every single thing it had been holding. If this is making your blood boil, if you know someone who has been crushed by HOA abuse of power, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. We want to know where in the world people are watching this, because what Judge Judy says next is something nobody in that courtroom was prepared for. Judge Judy set the bribe letter down on her desk with the same deliberate, unhurried calm that had defined every movement she had made since the proceedings began. She did not look at Diana Caldwell immediately. She looked at the letter for a moment, as though giving it one final read, as though making absolutely certain that what she was about to say was grounded in every word on that page and every document in that envelope and every second of everything she had witnessed in that courtroom from the moment Diana Caldwell had walked through the door. Then she looked up. And when she spoke, her voice had dropped to the register that people who have watched her for 25 years know is not a precursor to anger. It is the thing that comes after anger has finished its work and left behind something colder and more permanent in its place. She said 8 sentences. Not a speech. Not a lecture. 8 sentences delivered with the quiet, load-bearing precision of someone who has chosen every single word with the understanding that these particular words, spoken in this particular order, in this particular room, are going to follow Diana Caldwell for the rest of her life. Mrs. Caldwell, she began, you came into this courtroom today believing that money was a language I spoke. It is not. You targeted a 64-year-old widow for a vegetable garden her late husband dreamed of planting. You used your position to systematically exploit the most financially vulnerable people in your community. You diverted nearly $1 million in HOA funds that did not belong to you. You discriminated against homeowners based on their ethnicity. You attempted to bribe this court. And then you sat in that chair and looked at your phone while Rosa Mendez told this courtroom about losing her husband. Of all the things I have seen in 25 years on this bench, that last one tells me everything I need to know about who you are. The courtroom held its silence for 11 full seconds after the 8th sentence landed. 11 seconds in a room with cameras and microphones and a live studio audience is an extraordinary length of time. Long enough that the silence itself became the story. Long enough that every person watching at home understood without being told that something had just happened that went beyond a courtroom ruling and into the territory of genuine reckoning. Diana Caldwell did not move during those 11 seconds. She did not blink at any visible rate. She sat in her chair the way a building sits in the first moments after its foundational columns have been severed, still upright only because the full consequence of what has just happened has not yet finished traveling through the structure. Rosa Mendez, sitting across the room, had her eyes closed. Her hands were still folded on top of Eduardo's folder. Her lips were moving very slightly, and the woman sitting closest to her in the audience would later say that she believed Rosa was praying, or perhaps simply talking to Eduardo, which in Rosa's life had always been more or less the same thing. Judge Judy's ruling came in 4 parts, delivered without pause and without the theatrical emphasis that lesser moments might have invited, because the facts themselves carried all the weight that was needed and she knew it. First, every dollar of the $22,000 in accumulated fines levied against Rosa Mendez was voided in its entirety, declared unlawfully imposed and permanently unenforceable. Second, Diana Caldwell was ordered to pay Rosa Mendez $45,000 in total damages, representing the $22,000 in wrongfully collected fines, and an additional $23,000 covering emotional distress, the wrongful placement of a lien against her home, and the legal costs Rosa had incurred fighting a case that should never have existed. Third, the lien against Rosa's property was ordered dissolved effective immediately, restoring to Rosa Mendez the full and unencumbered ownership of the home that Eduardo had helped her afford and that Diana Caldwell had spent 14 months trying to take from her. Rosa opened her eyes when the third part of the ruling was delivered. She looked down at Eduardo's folder. She picked it up and held it against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you were afraid of losing, and a single tear ran down her left cheek, and she smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was something quieter and more complete than triumph. It was the smile of someone who planted a garden because they loved someone and refused to let it be taken away and turned out, after everything, to have been right to refuse. The fourth part of the ruling addressed matters that extended beyond the jurisdiction of the courtroom but not beyond the reach of Judge Judy's voice or the attention of 14 million viewers. She stated clearly, on camera, with the enunciation of someone who understands that clarity in this particular moment is itself a form of consequence, that she was referring the Silverbrook Heights HOA financial records to the Arizona Attorney General's office for formal investigation of potential embezzlement and criminal misappropriation of community funds. She was referring the selective enforcement documentation to the Arizona Civil Rights Division for investigation of potential fair housing violations under both state and federal law. And she was referring Diana Caldwell's written bribe attempt to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office for investigation of attempted corruption of a legal proceeding, which under Arizona statute carried the potential for felony classification. Diana's attorney stood up. It was a reflexive gesture, the legal instinct to object or intervene or at minimum create the appearance of doing something useful. Judge Judy turned her eyes toward him with an expression so complete in its authority that he sat back down before his mouth had fully opened, without having produced a single word, which was perhaps the most honest contribution he had made to the proceedings all afternoon. Judge Judy then did something she rarely does, something that the show's longtime producers would later describe as one of the most memorable moments in 25 years of filming. She turned slightly toward the camera, not to perform, not to play to the audience, but with the directness of someone who has something to say to a specific person and has just identified where that person is sitting. She spoke to every homeowner watching at home who had ever received a violation notice that felt less like enforcement and more like a targeting. She spoke to every elderly resident who had ever been told by an HOA officer that the fine was non-negotiable and the committee's decision was final and the governing documents were clear and there was simply nothing to be done. She said that HOA authority is a trust extended by a community to someone they believe will use it fairly, and that using it instead as a financial weapon against vulnerable neighbors while protecting wealthy ones is not community governance. It is predation with a clipboard and a set of bylaws, and it deserves to be treated exactly as seriously as any other form of predation. The audience rose. Not in the polite, prompted way that studio audiences sometimes rise, but all at once, spontaneously, the way people stand when something has been said that they have needed to hear for a long time and have finally, unexpectedly, been given the experience of hearing it said out loud by someone with the authority to make it matter. Judge Judy let it go for 3 seconds. Then she raised her hand and the room settled back into its seats and she turned back to Diana Caldwell one final time. Her voice, in these last words, was the quietest it had been all day. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "you thought your money could walk into this courtroom and rearrange the furniture. What it actually did was hand me everything I needed to make sure you never do this to anyone again." The gavel came down once, clean and final, and it was over. Diana Caldwell stood from her chair slowly, the way people stand when they are not entirely certain their legs will cooperate, testing each movement before committing to it. Her attorney was already closing his satchel. The 4 color-coded binders, each one tabbed in 3 colors, each one representing a category of legal argument that had never been given the chance to matter, went back into the bag one by one. Diana looked across the room at Rosa Mendez, just once, for no more than 2 seconds, and Rosa met her eyes with the steady, unafraid gaze of a woman who had stopped being frightened of this particular person on the day she picked up the phone and called a television producer and said she needed someone to listen. Diana looked away first. In 11 years of HOA presidency, across 23 legal disputes and 14 forced departures and countless closed-door confrontations, Diana Caldwell had never once looked away first. She walked out of the courtroom without speaking, and the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway was the last thing anyone in that room heard from her for a very long time. If Rosa's story moved you, if you believe that HOA power should never be used as a weapon against vulnerable people, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a moment of justice like this one, and drop your city in the comments. We want to see exactly where in the world people are standing up and saying enough is enough. The episode aired on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, the clip of Judge Judy reading Diana Caldwell's bribe letter aloud had been viewed 31 million times across every major platform. By Friday, that number had crossed 67 million. The 8 sentences, the ones that ended with the observation about Diana looking at her phone during Rosa's testimony, had been shared 4.2 million times on a single platform in under 48 hours. People were not sharing it because it was dramatic, though it was. They were sharing it because it named something they recognized, the specific, suffocating experience of being in the presence of someone who holds power over you and cannot be bothered to pretend they care about what happens to you. That experience does not belong exclusively to HOA disputes. It lives in workplaces and courtrooms and landlord offices and government waiting rooms across the country, and when Judge Judy identified it by name and attached a consequence to it, millions of people felt something release in their chests that they had not realized they were holding. The Arizona Attorney General opened a formal investigation into Silverbrook Heights HOA finances within 72 hours of the episode airing. The Maricopa County District Attorney confirmed receipt of the criminal referral regarding the bribe attempt and initiated a preliminary review. Diana's attorney withdrew from representation within a week, citing conflicts he declined to specify publicly. The HOA board held an emergency session and voted to suspend Diana from the presidency pending investigation, with one of the 4 votes cast by her own sister, who had reviewed the financial audit and made the quiet, practical decision that family loyalty has a dollar limit and $890,000 in missing funds was several $100,000 past it. The white Range Rover with the rule-set license plate was photographed 3 weeks later in the parking lot of a bankruptcy attorney's office on a Tuesday morning. Rosa Mendez used part of her settlement to expand Eduardo's garden across the full rear yard of her home. She grows 6 varieties of tomatoes now, because Eduardo had written about 6 varieties in his sketch on the grocery receipt. She framed that receipt and hung it in her kitchen. She has received no violation notices. She does not expect any. She goes out every morning to check on the tomatoes, and sometimes, when the light is right and the garden is full and green and exactly what Eduardo imagined it would be, she talks to him while she works. She tells him it turned out fine. She tells him the garden is beautiful. And she tells him she planted it anyway, just like he always said she should.